the biggest, I think, drawback to intermittent fasting, even for those folks though, and so when I say who have maybe some guidance on doing it the right way, is getting enough protein. So just preserving that lean body mass, and that's something we've started to learn. It was something that we sort of suspected and certainly, sort of bore out in the studies, was that when you looked at folks who were utilizing the intermittent fasting for weight loss, they were able to achieve weight loss successfully, but there was, mostly lean body mass and not the fat loss. So
welcome back to Against the Herd, where we explore unconventional approaches that lead to unconventional results, and it's through interviewing unconventional guests. Today's guest is none other than Brooke Schneid, and Brooke will be on a few other podcasts as we go forward, as we learn and uncover more information. But just to give you a little bit of background on Brooke, Brooke is a registered dietitian, sports nutritionist, and a board-certified specialist in obesity and weight management, with a master's degree in science and clinical nutrition, and over 10 years in optimizing nutrition from everything from chronic disease management to weight management and sports performance. This was a phenomenal podcast. We learned a lot of information that otherwise is really kept from us, kept from the public, but she gets to see this in everyday cases with both her current practice as well as just talking and discussing weight management or weight issues with her clients. So I hope you enjoyed it a fraction as much as Nick and I enjoyed it. Stay against the herd. Let's get into this. Brooke, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Obviously, we've had conversations before from your coaching practice, and I'd really love to start this interview with a little bit of, tell us what you're best known for and your background and your education.
Yeah, so and first of all, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk with you guys today. So I am a clinical dietitian by trade, a clinical dietitian, registered dietitian, nutritionist, all of the names apply. So I work in a few different settings. I work in a clinical setting where I counsel folks who are seeking weight loss surgery or just kind of seeking weight loss through medical supervision. I also work in a contract sort of setting where I work with corporate professionals who are looking to incorporate healthy eating and lifestyle practices into their busy work life. I also have a private practice where I see folks for anything from primarily weight management to chronic disease management and prevention, as well as sports nutrition, which is just kind of my side passion and really what brought me into the field of nutrition. And yeah, so I work in a few different settings, but mostly focused on the clinical management of overweight and obesity, as well as helping folks implement sports nutrition for optimal performance.
And I absolutely love that. And so would I love to at least start and touch on as much as you want to, but what brought you into this field? Like, what was the point at which you knew exactly this was the direction that you wanted to go in?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bruce. And I get it a lot actually when I first started in the field, because my undergraduate degree was in political science. So as you can imagine, getting into the field of nutrition, I got that question a lot, like, why are you here again? And actually the truth is that it did take me sort of I took a roundabout route. But growing up, I was dancing from the age of 2. So really from the time I could walk, I was dancing. And went on to dance professionally. I was a collegiate athlete, so I played soccer in college as well. And I think particularly as a female athlete, with two really sort of sports, well, one fine art, and one sport that were really competing in terms of nutrition, right? So I really struggled as a young woman trying to balance the nutritional needs of these two very different types of sports. One that was also like very aesthetic focused and, used very long fiber muscles, and one that required really a lot of carbohydrate fuel and a lot of short fiber muscles. And so I struggled with that. And I think I just always, as a result of trying to balance those different needs, I always had an interest in nutrition. I was always reading about it and trying to learn things that would help. and struggled a lot along the way, just not having the energy I needed as a young female athlete. And so when I went into college, I carried on. As I said, I played soccer, and then I also continued dancing. Eventually I left the soccer team to pursue dance more full time. And after college was sort of dabbling in sort of political science related fields, and not really excited about it. So, I did sort of what every post grad does, is sort of think about like what I'm passionate about and what sorts of things I was reading in my own spare time. And so that's when I realized, oh, nutrition, obviously, it's something I've always been interested in. It's just kind of been the common thread throughout all of my, experiences and sort of those formative years. So it was just later in life that I realized, oh, I can really make a career out of this, and went looking for, continuing education around it.
I love that. And you brought up a number of times in there carbs, right? And one of the questions that's been always burning is, and I don't know when it happened. When did carbs become the culprit to everything? Like, when did it become the bad guy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's a few different ways to answer that. And I think the first one is sort of the historical answer, or the historical story behind, the vilification of fat, right? Which is what happened first because of the high rates of heart disease in America. And, so there was really a push or a campaign for a low fat diet. And I think, as a result of that push for a low fat diet to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, there was a sort of accidental increase in these carbohydrates. Now, I think that's something that's really important to point out, is because in nutrition and sort of interpreting nutrition research, people get really hung up on isolating these nutrients. But what you have to recognize is that when you eat less of one thing, you're always going to eat more of something else. And so, so yes, there was the replacement of carbohydrate, but of course, eating less fat and more carbohydrate didn't mean that we were eating, more beans and lentils and brown rice and quinoa, right? Or starchy vegetables. We were eating more of these packaged, processed, refined carbohydrate sources. And so as that sort of low fat craze took off, and over the years, the rates of obesity, continued to rise. And so there was this sort of thinking that, well, if the reduction in fat and the increase in carbohydrate was concurrent with this increase in obesity, then it must be the carbohydrates that are bad. But that really totally misses the fact that these carbs were really poor quality. And also, if you look at the increase in calories over that same period of time, right? That same period of time, I think that most of the studies look at like from 1970 to 2008. You see that the calorie increase was about 500 calories per person in the United States, and only about 250 of those calories were increased carbohydrates. So you could say that carbohydrates are about 50% to blame, right? So there's just a lot of different things that were going on there that conflated the picture. And that's when I think, carbs just started to be really vilified. So that's kind of the historical piece. But yeah, you just kind of layer in, I think the cultural pieces too. Like I always say, we have a lack of exercise. We have an inactivity epidemic, and so if you factor in the fact that, consuming more of these refined carbohydrates with the way that lifestyle changed as a culture and a society in the US too, activity levels were going down at the same time, right? And the best way that we utilize those carbohydrate sources is also through increased activity. So again, just a multitude of factors, but I think it definitely started with that push for a low fat diet.
That makes sense. And that's fantastic historical context. What's your take on keto? I know a lot of people may be familiar with that as well. I personally use that and it worked for me, but I also understand that it can lead to, disordered eating. People can hate it. They can be under this constant stress of it as well. So, I've heard both positive and negative. I'm just curious your take on, is it a useful tool for all, only some in certain scenarios, or where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, I think moving away from the science, or just kind of separating myself from the science a little bit, I can say that in practice, I am not generally a fan or a proponent of a keto diet. And I think that's mostly because of what we end up seeing over the long term, as is the case really with any sort of restrictive dietary approach, is that if it's not sustainable, it usually backfires in some way. And the way that it backfires for keto and for most people is an elevation in lipid panel, right? Like whether it's total cholesterol, triglycerides, LDL, and that's obviously a real concern given that atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the US, as far as I'm pretty sure about that. So, that's a significant concern, especially for folks who may be utilizing a ketogenic diet for weight loss. If they're if they are struggling with morbid obesity, and now we have a temporary, significant, even, that's fine. I'll give it that. But if it's a temporary weight loss with an increase in lipids, then I think that's more problematic than it is beneficial. Having said that, I fully acknowledge that from a scientific standpoint, and and just kind of in other anecdotal situations, the keto diet can be very beneficial. And I think, you might be an example of someone who doesn't have to follow that over a prolonged period of time, and kind of maybe has the knowledge and the experience to come off of it in a healthful way. I certainly have used a ketogenic diet, or what we would call a modified Atkins diet, for neurological reasons in a clinical setting. It's definitely not my specialty, but I have worked with neurological departments before to help implement that. So there's absolutely no doubt that a ketogenic is beneficial for that population. And then I think there is a group of people that probably fall in between kind of the category of people who we know it's beneficial for, that sort of like neurological or epileptic population. And then like maybe those with like chronic morbid obesity, who may have that more negative long-term outcome. And then I think there's definitely a population of people who somewhere in the middle might benefit, here and there for blood sugar regulation. Or I do know some cardiovascular clinics who are actually utilizing the ketogenic diet in a medically supervised way. So I do think that there are a variety of uses for it, but for the general population, I'm definitely not a fan. We also see in females, a lot of times testosterone levels end up going up. We have more testosterone than we do estrogen, but we shouldn't have as much as we do after something like an Atkins type or a keto diet. So my general opinion is to avoid it if we can.
No, that's fantastic, and you're doing a great job of separating, the scientific
Mm-hmm.
side from the practical
Mm-hmm.
side as well, which I think many people will find useful. So thank you very much for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess while we're on the topic of fad diets that are very common now,
Yeah.
Curious your take as well on intermittent fasting. Right, we've heard a lot of research about that, how that can have some neurological effects as well, which again, super interesting with the keto diet, as you mentioned, and just goes to show how all-encompassing nutrition is, for the whole body,
Right.
including the mind. But curious, again, similar question. Curious your take on intermittent fasting, tool that many should be using, or potentially better than it seems.
Yeah. I mean, intermittent fasting is definitely one that I would keep in my purview, that I would say is always on the table. Intermittent fasting, as you probably know, fasting is an umbrella term, but intermittent fasting is also a very broad umbrella term. Whether it's like a 24-hour fast could still be considered an intermittent fast. You can have alternate day fasting, which would be considered intermittent fasting. And then you have, the most popular, 16-8 intermittent fast. It's the one that most people implement when they're experimenting with intermittent fasting. And so, yeah, so I do want to just make that clarification, because I think there are some different implications, both near term and long term, for those different types of or approaches to intermittent fasting. But to speak to like the 16-8 approach specifically, I would say what's important for folks to know is that the way that works for weight loss is through calorie restriction. And that's neither good nor bad, but it's just a fact of the matter that what seems to be the mechanism there is that it's ultimately just another form of calorie restriction. And so if that works for folks, again, over the long term, a lot of, corporate professionals, for example, that I work with find it really hard to get breakfast in the morning. And so there are folks that just kind of suits their lifestyle, and it's a natural progression for them to try the intermittent fasting. And I think supporting folks in doing it the right way, who may be able to sustain that for the long term, it can be a great tool at restricting calories. The biggest, I think, drawback to intermittent fasting, even for those folks though, and so when I say who have maybe some guidance on doing it the right way, is getting enough protein. So just preserving that lean body mass, and that's something we've started to learn. It was something that we sort of suspected, and certainly, sort of bore out in the studies, was that when you looked at folks who were utilizing the intermittent fasting for weight loss, they were able to achieve weight loss successfully, but there was, mostly lean body mass and not the fat loss. So not the fat tissue loss. So that's especially problematic, I think, as you get into the older years, but it's still problematic for young folks who may be more active and really looking for, for a different outcome in terms of, lean body mass as well. It gets especially complicated to achieve the amount of protein that you would need on an intermittent fasting diet as well, because, we know that there's a bit of an uptake threshold. So in other words, you don't really want to be getting too much protein in at one time. And so if you have this restricted feeding window, you may still be in a position where you have to eat more frequently within that window in order to get those protein needs met, right? To offset that loss of lean body mass. So yeah, while I'm always, I always have like my antenna up high whenever someone is interested in implementing the intermittent fasting approach. I think it can be a great tool, and it's one of the approaches that I've seen, again, just to be most practical for folks. That 16/8 anyway version of it.
Understood. Well, you just easily led into another my favorite macro, the one I was planning on asking about, protein. So you mentioned, again, intermittent fasting. It may be tough for people to get in their the protein they need. Couple questions. How does one determine what their protein intake should be, and what does that distribution look like? Should it be weighted more heavily, night versus morning, every few hours, or how does that look?
Yeah, so I think, well, first, to kind of understand a person's protein needs, there's a big difference between protein to prevent deficiency and optimal protein intake. So I think, especially to support lean body mass, and generally, I think that's not well understood, but I would say generally what's recommended now is a gram per pound of body weight. Of course, if we have, access to body composition data, we can target that a little bit more specifically with lean body mass information. But I think for most,
is that same, is that same male and female, or is it different depending on sex?
Yeah, same 1 gram per pound for both males and females. And obviously, if you're someone who has, significant level of activity, or, it can shift, right, based on what your ultimate goals are, and your needs can change even at baseline, just based on, how active you are and the types of activity you're doing. So I will caveat it with that. But that's kind of the general recommendation would be a gram per pound of body weight. And so, as you can imagine, it can be pretty easy for folks to get upwards of like 120, 140 grams of protein a day. And if you only have 8 hours to do it in, that can be very difficult. And yeah, so I would say that threshold is generally understood to be, we used to say like 32 used to be sort of the position statement. Now I think it's a little bit more comfortably up around 40. I think the range is like 30 to 50, if I'm not mistaken. And so we tend to kind of focus right in that 40 gram range. And so, yeah, so you can see 40 grams multiple times a day to get that protein in can be really difficult. And in terms of how we like to see that spread out, I'd say as consistently across the course of the day as possible. And mostly that just has to do with that uptake threshold, right? Because if you are trying to get more than 10 and less than or equal to 40, then you usually are forced to spread that out. So what we don't want to see is what I think some people fall into, especially with a fasting approach, whether it's that 16/8 or even like a 24-hour fast, is that you end up with this one meal, usually at the end of the day, that has that large bit of protein. And maybe it's a good lean source of protein, and maybe there's lots of vegetables at that meal too, and you can get it all down because you're super hungry, you haven't eaten all day, but we're not utilizing all of that. So I think, there are benefits to spreading it out consistently across the day, even if that threshold didn't make it difficult. But those would be, in my opinion, or I think, I guess I'll say, in my opinion, that becomes impractical. Yeah, I mean, well, how could I say this? So there are benefits to getting it consistently that are not supported by evidence. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So I would still recommend that even if that threshold didn't exist, that it would still be beneficial from a practicality standpoint, because you might be more hungry. You might not have stable energy levels. You might not have stable blood sugar levels if you have this protein spread all out. So protein, because of its role in stabilizing appetite and stabilizing blood sugars, there is a practical benefit to spreading that out. The research would say otherwise. The research would say probably as long as we get more than 10 and less than 40, then we're okay. But again, from intermittent fasting standpoint, that would kind of necessitate that consistent distribution anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that it's phenomenal. So two questions in there on the same topic is there diminishing returns from having too much protein in? And then the second one in there, when you take now that our world is in a sedentary lifestyle, is getting the same is does that protein still need to be the exact same even if you're barely getting out? Like sometimes maybe you're barely able to get a walk in the
Mm-hmm.
workday.
Yeah, I mean, so to answer the first question, I think yes and no. Assuming calories are equal, right? Then I'd say there's not necessarily diminishing returns from getting a higher percentage of your calories from protein. So like, spoiler alert, it's okay to do low carb diet and have a larger percentage of calories coming from protein. I think the important thing would be that you're utilizing that, hopefully. If you have, smaller bursts, smaller amounts of protein, maybe as a result of that, it may not be contributing to muscle protein synthesis. It may be actually contributing to glucose production, and that's okay. Again, like if all calories are equal. But if you have goals that are specifically around building lean body mass, then you need that protein to be supporting that muscle protein synthesis. So I think at that point, you will probably see some diminishing returns if you're just having excess protein, in one sitting. So I would call that diminishing returns because that just starts to sort of present as excess calories. And if you're trying to build lean body mass and manage weight as well, then that complicates things. The other question you asked was about protein goals for a less active population. I still do recommend a gram per pound. Most of the time, because of when we look at folks who are inactive, I would say if they are also overweight or they have obesity, then their calorie needs would still be higher than most. And so usually when we're calculating protein requirements, there's a number of different ways to look at it. But I think looking at what that 1 gram per pound is, what it equates to from a quantity standpoint, and then also looking at as a percentage of calories. Now we don't really make protein recommendations as a percentage of calories anymore. You might be familiar with like at least 20%, standard 20% diet. We don't really look at it that way, but I think in the clinical setting and using clinical judgment, that's always a good cross check. Like where is that going to put us, and is that going to be practical? But most of the time, it still puts us well within reason in terms of how we might distribute the rest of those calories. So I think both from an optimizing health and longevity standpoint and supporting the lean body mass, as well as just balancing calories, I think that it still makes sense to use that 1 gram per pound in most cases. Now, when you look at like the morbidly obese population, that often is not feasible. So either in those cases, I try to get access to body composition data, or we use a much more crude calculation, which is ideal body weight. And that's a simple calculation, plus or minus 10% for stature. And then so sometimes I'll start there. And again, look at that. What does that number give me? And then what does that look like as a percentage of calories? And usually we can get a good happy medium. But that's a good question. In general, I would still go for 1 gram per pound.
Understood. And so I wanted to switch Nick, we can cut some of this out, Brooke, but did
Mhm.
you want to stay on the same topic?
Just
I
on
was
the
going to
same
switch gears.
topic. Yes, on the same topic, as somebody who's incredibly busy, as I'm sure many of our listeners are, I rely on protein shakes to get that protein intake. So you've already informed me that my practice of having a giant protein shake in the morning is probably best split up into 2 or 3. But curious your thoughts on, is that okay, right? If somebody is busy and having 2 protein shakes a day, are there benefits to that? Also curious if you have any strong opinions on whey versus plant-based protein, as I know there's been some argument or discussion about that recently as well.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I mean, I would be remiss as a dietitian if I didn't let it, if I didn't state it clearly that I think it's always best to get your nutrients from food, right? And I'm always trying to move, patients, clients, whatever in that direction. But as you can see, in the context of intermittent fasting, is that's just what we talked about, and it's the perfect example of how a supplement often becomes necessary. It's not just a source of convenient protein, which I think is, not to be scoffed at because that's a real practical concern for a lot of people. But it also is necessary, and I think there's a lot of really good opportunities to be utilizing protein supplements in just about every population that I can think of. And if you'd asked me, 5, 10 years ago what I thought about that, I probably would have said, you almost never need it. But I think just the shift in how we think about daily protein requirements, and I think just recognizing the difficulty with which people have meeting those requirements, protein supplements are great. And now those can look a lot of different ways. There's, ready to drink shake options, and there's powders that you mix with other things. There's powders that you might use just with water, and there's folks who use them more with smoothies. So I think it's hard to tease all that out. Like, I mean, everybody's needs are different. And there are some folks who I might say, you know what, I don't recommend a smoothie, but try that powder with water or low fat milk or something, and we're good. So yeah, it's kind of hard to speak to all of those different, applications, but I do think protein supplements are useful. And as far as, what the other question, as far as
Whey versus
whey
plant-based
versus
protein or animal
plant-based,
versus
yes, of
plant
course,
protein.
that's one Bruce probably knows. That's one that I love to touch on because I work in a setting. Of course, one of the settings in which I work is in with a morbidly obese population, and in preparing for weight loss surgery, immediately after weight loss surgery, protein supplements are used almost exclusively. But I think also it's true for active individuals, for people that are seeking protein supplements. It's often something that they plan very strategically to utilize on a regular basis. So my biggest concern when it comes to protein powders is heavy metal contamination, because about, oh gosh, it's been less than a decade now, but there was a good body of research that showed that protein powders were, heavily contaminated with heavy metals, or persistently showing up to have high levels of heavy metal contaminants. And so, there's some clinical questions around like, well, what is the cutoff and what do we need to be worried about? And we compare to sort of, every state has different guidelines as what's acceptable in their products. And so, but I think again, like if you're utilizing a protein supplement every single day and you know that it has this heavy metal contamination, then that's even more problematic to me. I don't think we want to shuffle that aside and say, well, a little bit of heavy metals is fine. No, I think that's not okay, right? If we're using it every single day, that's going to build up and cause problems. So I started, there was a nonprofit organization that actually grew directly out of that research called the Clean Label Project. And they used to do a really good job of reporting on and testing protein powders. I've had a little harder trouble accessing their database. I think it's under construction or whatever, but for years I was keeping up with their testing. And so they would publish the top 5 that tested the cleanest, the lowest level of heavy metal contaminants, and then the lowest 5, right? So the ones that had the highest levels of contaminants. And we learned some things just trending in those reports. And one of the things was that plant-based and organic protein powders always trended higher in heavy metal contaminants. And so, as you can imagine, that raises a big red flag because you usually have a captive audience when it comes to protein powders, folks who are interested in doing something healthy, who want to, promote wellness in their lifestyle in some way. So that's problematic. Now, not all of them, I should say, but that was the trend, right? And then you have the whey-based protein powders, which just, again, they are not plant-based. Some of them are organic, but most of them seem to test a little bit better. But again, even across the board within the whey-based and the plant-based, you could see some variety in heavy metal contaminants. So number one thing I tell folks is let's be sure that we know what you're using if you're going to be using it on a regular basis. And so, there's a few kind of go-tos that I typically share. But that's just a heavy metal contaminant piece. Number two, let's recognize that, plant-based proteins can be effective. And so if you're vegan or vegetarian and you need to go that route, let's recognize it. That's perfectly fine. In general, I do recommend whey. That's because, in my sports nutrition work, it's a more fast-acting protein. And so it's usually more effective for that muscle protein synthesis in the way that people are using it. And also, in the surgical or clinical setting, whey is better for gut bacteria. So it usually helps with, optimizing recovery and those kinds of things. So I usually do recommend whey-based protein powders, and always let people know who have lactose intolerance that if you go with whey protein isolate, it can be suitable. So yeah, I'd say those are sort of the main considerations in terms of like whey versus plant-based. I think that kind of covers my thoughts on the protein powders or supplements.
That's a phenomenal answer. And just one quick follow up on
Mm-hmm.
that. Would you mind naming some of those sources where people can look up those heavy metal contaminants? You named the Clean Label Project, but I'm sure many of our listeners, am guilty of, Amazon reviews being
Sure.
my, there's somebody 2 reviews down said is contaminated. Look somewhere else, which as we all know is not based necessarily in any fact.
Yeah.
So what resources, if you have any that you could name, could somebody use to make sure that they're ingesting clean sources of protein?
Yeah, I love that you're asking that, because I think third-party testing is kind of becoming like this ubiquitous claim that supplement protein powders use now, because people are kind of onto it, right? But it's important to know that third-party testing doesn't necessarily mean it's being tested for heavy metal contaminants. So that's a really important distinction. The Clean Label Project, as I said, I'm not sure what's going on with their website, but it is normally accessible under the website puremarket.com. You can also visit their website at cleanlabelproject.org. And they have like some white papers accessible there, and I think some products available there as well, limited database, I guess you could say. And then Clean Label Project does now have certification that they are like accrediting products with, so you can actually look for the Clean Label Project icon on the different products. The other two that I usually recommend are NSF, Informed Choice, and Informed Sport. So those are, labels that you can look for on the protein supplement itself that will let you know if it's been third-party tested that includes heavy metals. There's actually Informed Sport and Informed Choice. One of them includes heavy metals and one of them doesn't. I don't remember which is which, but they're both really pretty good to look for anyway. Most of the time when one is there, the other one's there too.
I feel like, Brooke, Nick and I are just going to like fight over how many questions we can ask you in an hour time.
Sure.
So shifting gears, actually, this has been a burning question. Carnivore diets really became popular recently. Why? And can you give us the breakdown of like what's happening, and what are the benefits, and is that a sustainable diet?
Mm-hmm. I cannot tell you why. I don't try to understand. I think that is one of the ones where I'm like, absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, well, as a dietitian too, there's just some things that I don't like waste my time reading, but you can imagine the thought process when you think about, the campaign against vegetables having toxic compounds, or not eating beans and legumes because of lectins, or so I think it's always derived by some nutrition reductionism. Like, I think if you've heard that term, right, it's this idea that we are reducing the components of food to their reductionist parts, right, which is just not the way that we consume foods. We consume foods as, all the different compounds have this symbiotic, relationship, and we know that they interact in a unique way inside the body. So it's just not the same to try to isolate these different elements. And I think that, that's kind of probably where it comes from. And I think it's very misleaded. I think the folks who are following it are just very misguided, unfortunately. There is just no way that you could justify eliminating fruits and vegetables and plant compounds from a diet and expect it to be healthful over the long term. And I know that there's been enough there's been enough of a like nutritional consensus around that I haven't really investigated it further, but yeah, that I'd say that's the one that I'm like, absolutely not. Try to be sensitive to what works for different folks, but that is not something that is anyway going to be healthy.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and it just makes sense looking on the outside in. But you bring up another, just as you're talking, right? Where do you think we're missing the boat from an educational standpoint on just understanding diets? Because we'll get influencers that are just
Mm-hmm.
coming in that are ripped, and then they're saying one thing, and then we also I don't know I'd love to understand your take on the food pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think, what would you like to see different in terms of the information that's starting out at a very young age to what we're seeing now for adults and working environments?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head, right? Which is starting at a young age. And so if you were to ask me where are we missing the boat from an education standpoint, it's just with young kids, right? I mean, there's a way to talk about nutrition, I think, that can be, positive and educational. And I think that that's where the problem lies, right? I can't tell you how many times a day, I have the conversation around what defines a meal, right? Like, what is a meal? How do I think about creating this plate? And, I'm happy that we've kind of moved from the pyramid to the plate. I'm not sure if you're aware, that's kind of the choose my plate is sort of more of the modern day pyramid. And I think in a lot of ways that is more useful. But I think, again, like how, you have a lot of these and they're sort of less, they're sort of maybe less popular. The media talks about them less nowadays, but all of these like edible garden and, school garden educational programs that were implemented, Alice Waters out in California is famous for Chez Panisse restaurant, and she started this edible schoolyard, and many other people did this similar type of educational program for kids across the country where, they educated kids around nutrition, but they did that with the help of a garden, showing them where their food grows and all of that. And the outcomes that they were measuring, didn't just relate to health and nutrition. They related to, IQs and testing and reading and those kinds of outcomes that are more directly related to the classroom. So I just think it's so obvious that we need some basic nutrition education at, in the younger years. And, maybe it's not, in elementary school kids, I don't know, but I think it definitely needs to happen, in the younger years. And so I think just the fact that that's not happening is the biggest gap that I could say. And exactly how that's done, I'm not sure. But, so much of this emphasis on doctors don't get nutrition education is, to me, not productive, because doctors are doing medical care, right? I saw someone said recently, like, trying to harp on doctors not having, nutrition education in medical schools, like getting on a dietitian for not having enough education in writing a prescription for a medication, right? Like, that's not our job, right? And so I just wish that we would move away from that harping on doctors not having nutrition education and start recognizing, dietitians and nutritionists as being the experts, and starting to take that a little bit more seriously, because that gets at your point too about like social media and influencers, and this misinformation comes a lot from, this is a whole nother conversation, I don't want to get on a tangent, but there has also been historically lack of regulation around the term nutritionist. And so there is confusion because anyone, in some states, it's getting better in others, But in a lot of states still across the US, anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. So you could open a practice tomorrow. Bruce, you could say, I'm a nutritionist, come see me for nutrition information. And anyone in the lay public wouldn't know that you have no background or education or credentials in nutrition. So that's also just a big part of the problem. So yeah, I guess generally I wish we would move away from, kind of harping on the doctors not having that education and instead shift our focus on letting registered dietitians provide the education in the younger years. And yeah, how that would be done exactly, I don't know. But like from my experience and anecdotally in clinical practice and in counseling day in and day out, I think we just need to talk about foods at the most basic level, and touching on the pyramid and the plate and stuff like that. I think one of the big misperceptions about nutrition just generally is that we don't know what a healthy diet looks like. And I just think there's nothing further from the truth. So we could argue like, semantics and like a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, but we know, and we have known, and their studies are there for a really long time, what the basic fundamentals of a healthy diet are, right? Like lean protein, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, like that's it, guys, right? So I think we do have the opportunity at least start to give that basic education a little bit more seriously, in the childhood or early adolescent years.
Fantastic. And I think you touched on something that I want to explore a bit more. It's a bit of a meta question, but how does somebody find and engage with a nutritionist? I feel like some people might be concerned, oh, this is crazy expensive. That's for, famous people. Or they might think, hey, I'm just struggling to lose a couple pounds, but I don't have a full-blown eating disorder, or at least think I don't. So, the nutritionists are for those people. I'm just going to tough it out here and keep, reading stuff online by myself. So could you go a little, how does somebody find a registered nutritionist that's not just throwing up a sign like Bruce would in your anecdote? And what does a typical engagement look like? Maybe with somebody who's not on the morbid obese side, which you specialize in, but maybe a more, person on the athletic side, or a more lay person who wants to, increase performance or hit some goals.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first of all, I do just kind of want to reinforce that what you would want to look for, first of all, right? That's important, is like you would want to look for a registered dietitian. And because of that licensure issue and the question around nutritionist, that has been changed. So now a registered dietitian can opt to call themselves a registered dietitian or a registered dietitian nutritionist. Or if they call themselves a nutritionist, they should still have the RD credential accessible. So you should still see that. So that's the first thing, is you want to make sure that who you're seeing is the credentialed professional, and that would need to be an RD or an RDN. And in terms of how to access them, I think, I always tell folks, to go to eatright.org, which is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics professional organization. And you can, it's not a comprehensive database, but you can like look up by location or specialty on that site. So that's one resource where you can get some names and numbers of practicing dietitians in your area. And then the other thing is to go to your primary care physician or go to where you receive medical care, because you would be surprised how many medical practices have dietitians on staff, whether it's in their internal medicine clinic, or they have a weight management clinic, or they have a cardiovascular dietitian in their cardiovascular department, or an endocrinology department might have a certified diabetes educator who's also a dietitian. So there are dietitians accessible usually in some shape or form in the practice. And if not, they may be able to refer you to one. A lot of insurance plans are covering nutritional counseling. Some have specific medical diagnoses that you would need to have, but a lot don't. So I think it's another great resource would just be to call your insurance company and ask, who's in network and, who can you contact, because they should have that information as well. I'll add one more thing to that, not to overly complicate things. But I do think it's important to find a dietitian that specializes in what you're looking for, because we are a specialized profession, right? We have dietitians who, most dietitians can do basic nutrition counseling, but if you are, interested in lowering lipid levels and you want to reduce cardiovascular lift, you might look for a dietitian that specializes in cardiovascular disease, or likewise, if you have diabetes or Probably more specialty requirement would be something like GI if you have IBS, or IBD, you have one of those types of conditions. So, again, seek out a dietitian. A lot can do, chronic disease prevention and medical nutrition therapy, as we call it. But if you have a specialized condition, try to see if you can find a specialist dietitian as well.
Fantastic. And so I want to shift gears because we touched on just athletes,
Mm-hmm.
and then you being an athlete as well. One thing that's very common, it's been talked about in boxing, it's been talked about in the UFC, is weight cutting.
Mm.
And how weight cutting has just been how, it's almost some people are dying from this.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain, one, the elements that are at play when you are weight cutting,
Mm-hmm.
the potential risk, and just what's going on in your body while you're doing that?
Yeah, I think the approaches to weight cutting tend to vary a little bit just depending on the sport. Sometimes that weight cutting, I think, is a little bit more chronic in like some of the track and field athletes, or in gymnasts, for example, that might be a little bit more chronic restriction. Whereas if you look at maybe like the wrestlers, or other folks in that sort of, I don't know, would you call it discipline, boxing and things like that, I think that tends to be a little bit more acute weight cutting, right? Where it's like the day of or day before. So the ramifications are a little bit different, but you have usually some severe form of calorie restriction that's going to be much more problematic when that calorie restriction is more chronic. So maybe less of an issue for the boxer or the wrestler, but a very serious issue for the track athlete or the gymnast, right? Especially females. There's some significant reproductive, issues there with amenorrhea, no longer having or ceasing the menstrual cycle for periods of time. And then, so the calorie restriction is one element. And then you also have dehydration, which becomes, a real problem as well. So I think, again, probably more often you see that with the weight class type of sports like wrestling and boxing and stuff, and not so much in just like the track athletes and the gymnasts, as I'm using those examples, just because those are not weight class events. There's just seems to be a slight advantage, or there's thought to be that advantage with lighter weight. So those are, I think, like the two main nutritional concerns as a result of that. Yeah, so I think you have the methods of producing that weight loss, and again, like calorie restriction, dehydration is another one, and then of course sometimes you see like the excessive exercise. So I think that it's more problematic for those who that is seen in a more chronic way versus those that it's seen in acutely. And I think also, I don't know this to be true for sure, but of course I know for sure that, female athletes tend to be affected really significantly. We have a term for that, the female athlete triad, where it's impacting their cycle, it's impacting bone health, and can lead to eating disorders as well. We also now know that there is, AREDS is a syndrome of like a chronic energy deficit syndrome. And I don't know as much about that, but, we are starting to understand more the chronic, I guess, side effects of those types of restrictions for weight cutting. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it certainly does. And I just think of the wrestlers that I went to high school with, and it was just their diets when it was that time. It was all at once. It was 100%, and then they would dial it all back. And I just always wonder, like, switching it, being on a teeter totter and putting your body through that, just can't be healthy. But
and as a follow up question to that, scaling it back from that heavy teeter totter, which we just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
what about the people who cycle between cutting and bulking? A lot of people, again, males especially, who are trying to put on muscle mass or significant muscle mass. It's very hard to do that without also putting on some body fat. So they bulk to get the muscle mass up, then they cut, trying to preserve muscle mass as they lose fat. Is that something, are there like recommended, are there any formulas for how much you should bulk and cut, like based on percentages of weight? Do you
Hmm.
find that to be a healthy strategy, overall long term, or is that something people should try to do for a more short term thing and then kind of stabilize or normalize somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a good answer. I mean, I definitely don't know the answer to whether there's a formula for how to do that. I don't work as much with that population, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is not, at least not an evidence-based one, because I would say that my understanding would be that that's detrimental, right? Because it would fall into, I mean, depending on how frequently you're doing that and what that looks like in terms of how much you're bulking, how much you're cutting. I think that that would fall pretty squarely into what we would call yo-yo dieting, and that has a really detrimental impact on resting metabolism over the long term, and how you store fat and how you mobilize storage and all of that. So I think I would classify that as a form of yo-yo dieting, and I think absolutely that would be detrimental. And I think if you just think about folks who are who have that history of yo-yo dieting, I can almost guarantee you that they're coming in years down the line, eating all the right things and doing all the right exercise and wondering why they're not seeing progress. And most of the time it has to do with that long-term historical, you know, struggle, whether it's like you could call it, building and cutting, or you could just call it yo-yo dieting. But again, it's going to have that same detrimental impact over the long term. So I think that's really important because I see that a lot, in a variety of different patient populations.
I have a question on sugar, and then second part to that is also caffeine, and it's because we are constantly consuming that, and it's all around us.
Mm-hmm.
So my questions around it is, with sugar, we know this to be a drug, and we know this to be addictive. I mean, what? Like what? But then there is good sugar, right? And then there's stevia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you just give us like a breakdown of what we should be doing, like as a consumer or as a practitioner of a healthy diet, of like what we should be looking for in terms of a healthy amount on the sugar, and then also on the caffeine side as well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'll talk about the sugar first. So you often hear sugar, demonized as a poison, and I don't like to think of it that way. So I always try to remind folks like sugar is actually not a poison. It's the dose that makes the poison, right? So we do have some upper limits in terms of how we think about added sugar specifically. Just to kind of share the numbers, that would be 9 teaspoons for men, which is 36 grams of added sugar a day, and it would be 6 teaspoons for women, which would be 24 teaspoons a day. And that's added sugar, again, an upper limit. We do not need to have any added sugar. So I always tell folks, it's good to just kind of have a sense of where you are compared to that number, because the big problem is the insidious nature of the added sugar, right? Is that we consume these products not knowing that there's added sugar. And when the nutrition labels changed a handful of years ago and started to include the breakdown of sugar, so that you could see that added sugar, that helped a lot. But I think there still is a lot of, confusion, and there's a lot of, a lack of transparency around added sugar. And so that's, I think, the biggest problem. I think also when you think about total sugar intake, whether we're talking about added sugar or not, I think it comes back again to carbohydrate and that, inactivity epidemic. And then I think that the carbohydrates are fundamentally meant to fuel our bodies. And that's not just, we weren't meant to be sitting down all day, right? So I do think that one of the things you can do is find out how much you're consuming. Another thing you can do is get more active. Uh, as far as access, I think that's something that I talk to my patients and clients about all the time, because you're right, we are perpetually bombarded with sugar, added sugar mostly. And if you have kids, you know this to be true from a very young age. It's everywhere, right? So we're constantly faced with saying no, and there is, willpower fatigue is real. So I think that environment is really key. I think we have the tendency to sort of put the burden on like willpower and self-discipline to do things like eliminate added sugar or cut calories. And really what we know to be true is that the folks who are successful are the folks who are setting up their environment to support those efforts. So I think just looking around and seeing where you have easy access, especially to those added sugar sources or just, refined sugar sources, is really important, and just making sure that your environment is conducive to your goals, whatever that may be, and certainly cutting back added sugar or eliminating it is an important one. So did I answer everything around the sugar, I guess?
You sure did.
Okay. And then caffeine, yeah, I mean, caffeine is, less problematic. I think the most problematic thing about caffeine is that it usually comes like hand in hand with the added sugar right now, right? So, I have folks who tell me, all the time, I'm trying to cut out caffeine. I'm like, 3 weeks without coffee. And the first thing I say is, why? Why? Coffee is super healthy. You can actually have protective benefits. Like there are tons of studies that show that coffee in particular can be protective of like certain cancers, up to 5 cups a day. So why do you want to cut that out? Does it make you feel jittery? Are you not sleeping well? Okay, right. But if it's all the added sugar, then okay, right? But I think it's really not the caffeine that's problematic. From a nutrition standpoint, it's more so that it comes so, tied with the added sugar, right? The lattes, the whatever, all of those drinks. The only thing I think that's important to mention about caffeine is what we know about sleep. And I'm not a sleep expert, so I won't get into too much of that. But obviously, I tend to try to have a pulse on sleep as a dietitian. There's some very direct and indirect implications that lack of sleep can have on nutrition, right? Either it's how we mobilize storage, or it's what kinds of foods we crave. For example, we know when our cortisol levels are elevated, we tend to crave sweets more often. So not getting away from the caffeine too much, but just to kind of say that I guess that would be the other sort of implication for caffeine, is that if it is impacting sleep, then I think that's a nutritionally valid reason to reduce it. But otherwise, caffeine in and of itself, isn't as harmful.
Love that. And just real, you can answer this very quickly because I'm sure Nick wants to jump in with a question. I'll give you an example. I came back from France and I bought an espresso machine because I wanted to replay that
Sure.
consistently. And I caught myself having like 8 shots of espresso. Like, so when we're talking about coffee, is coffee then espresso, or are you generalizing that as
No, I
a
would say that
whole?
includes. I would say that includes espresso. I'm not sure how that would translate in terms of portion sizes. I haven't looked at the research in a while, but I would say it's probably pretty safe to assume like a shot of espresso is a cup of coffee, right? In terms of caffeine, I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But
Well, Nick, you're in Miami. You tell us.
right.
Yes. But a Cuban cafecito from Miami has more.
Yeah, and so yeah, I would say that there probably is a threshold, but and maybe after that threshold, it's not that it's problematic, but maybe you don't see those preventive benefits. I don't know the answer, I guess. What?
Makes sense. But it's helpful that I did not know in terms of, because I'm one of those people that was just like, I'm taking a break from coffee. It's been too much. And now I want to go back.
Yeah, obviously if you see it impacting your sleep, that's a real problem, right? Or you see that you're not feeling well and you can't focus because you're jittery, that's a real problem, not a nutritional one, but that's a problem. But yeah, otherwise, I always tell folks got high levels of polyphenols, and again, like some cancer protective compounds as well. So there are a lot of really healthful benefits, not just not harmful, right? But healthful benefits to coffee and tea.
Understood. Well, we blew through again more than I thought we would possibly cover. I guess for me, kind of in closing, is there anything that you think people should know, like any hot tips or anything that you see as commonalities that you are telling your clients frequently that we may not have covered today? Any tips, that you just quick little tips that you find are useful for anybody who's trying to improve their nutrition?
Yeah, I don't know that these are groundbreaking, but I can tell you that, one of the things that I see most often that I just think is common across the board is don't try to change too much at once. And I think it's just human nature to want to find, that quick, maybe it's not even a quick fix. Maybe it's just that you feel like you're taking a more monumental approach, right? And I see that, and I think the research shows us too that tends to lead to failure, right? When you try to change too many things at once, and I think that's pretty in line with habit formation research as well, right? But the best thing that you can do for your health and whatever nutrition related goals that you have is to start small, and to find some way to hold yourself accountable to little changes. You're going to build confidence when you see that you're successful with those small changes, and you're going to be in a position to build on that, which, like, that's a sneak peek of what you can expect working with a dietitian. I know I didn't elaborate on that. But to me, that's the number one thing is, and I think that that's hard. And from a counseling standpoint, it's just, there's no easy solution, but that's a big thing is try not to change too much too soon, maybe 1 to 3 goals that you can identify, and take a look at what you're doing now as you determine those goals. I don't know if it's, a good example, but if you want to make some significant excuse me, significant financial changes. Let's say you want to save to buy a house. The first thing that you need to do is you need to check and see what kind of financial situation you're in now to determine where you're going to, what you're going to do next with your money, right? Or who you're going to get advice from. And I think that, a simple food log, is not something that people use often enough. And Bruce knows I'm not a fan of tracking apps because I just think they're counterproductive. But I think just taking an approach like a simple food journaling approach, is can lighten the burden a little bit of that awareness and accountability and what it sometimes illuminates. But I think that's really important too. Is so don't do it too much too soon. Start with where you are, by figuring out what your diet looks like now, and just don't lose sight of the basics, right? Like more fruits and vegetables and lean proteins. Like that's going to be pretty much the message, no matter which approach you take.
I have 2 speed round questions for you before we let you go.
Okay.
And I can't believe this did not get brought up. Glass of red wine or skinny martini? Which one are you going with and why?
Wait, but what's a skinny martini?
I don't what it's the so they have the skinny vodka and just a dry martini.
Okay. I think either one. I mean, I think, if you think about like wine, I think the biggest problem is that 5 ounces of wine is not usually what people pour. But if we're comparing, like a 1.5 ounce, so like a shot of vodka, and we're comparing 5 ounces of wine, take what you enjoy the most and savor it, because that's all you should have. So you should
Fair
have
enough.
what you enjoy. They both have, pros and cons, but just make sure that that glass of wine is only 5 ounces, because I think that's the biggest misconception. If you didn't tell me and I just had to blindly choose, then I'd actually probably go for the martini just because of that, because a glass of wine at a restaurant or even at home usually is more like 10 ounces. So that's not comparing apples to apples.
Got it. All right. Last one for me.
Mm-hmm.
Grass fed beef or, choice, or select. Is there that big of a difference?
I guess it just always depends what lens you're using. I mean, yeah, and I always think that practicality reigns supreme, right? So it just depends on where you are and what that next step would look like for you. I don't want to tell your average Joe that you have to eat grass-fed, grass-finished beef, right? But a lot of times that is more nutrient dense, and there's lots of other implications that matter to someone like me, like maybe the sustainability of it, because I think you should eat meat, but let's make it so that we're continuing to sustain that. Um, I think the most important thing I would tell your average Joe is make it lean, make it a loin cut or make it a round cut, because 3 ounces of a loin cut, 135 calories, 3 ounces of a ribeye, 300 calories, and all of those extra calories are coming from saturated fat that's going to clog your arteries. So I think that's step number one. And if you have the ability to go to something that's like grass-fed, grass-finished, I think that's great, because we do see some more nutrients there, and it's better for the environment usually.
Fantastic. Brooke, I could not ask for a better podcast.
Oh,
I can't
thanks.
tell you, as someone that does the social media in terms of clips, we're gonna have a month's, maybe 2 months worth.
Oh, great. Well, please cut out all the plugging my phone and not knowing how to get online.
That'll be in the blooper reel
Okay,
when we
fine.
make it big time. What how can people get in touch with you? How can our viewers really be able to soak in
Mhm.
more of the information that you're able to provide?
I don't know. As you know, Bruce, I don't have much time. So I don't know. I mean, I tell people I'm well savvy bee on Instagram. I don't really share a ton anymore, but I'd love to do more. I also have a blog that I don't share on that much, so I always hesitate to give it out. But it's well savvy bee also, so I can always share that with you. I'd love to have the following. Maybe it would inspire me to share more. But otherwise, yeah, my work with BetterUp, like I don't source those members, as you know, so they can't really find me there unless,
Yeah.
well, they could go on to BetterUp and like pay by themselves. But and then in the clinical setting, I wouldn't be able to see those patients unless they're in Virginia, Maryland, DC, or like a state that doesn't have a licensure requirement. I have seen patients like in California because they don't have a licensure requirement. But obviously, that's just too convoluted to share with your audience. So I would probably just share like my Well Savvy Bee IG, and you can share the Well Savvy Bee website if you want. I'm always trying to share more, and every now and then I update like my favorite recipes, and every now and then I share things. Unless you think that's counterproductive, then I don't know what to tell you. I'm on LinkedIn
No.
also, and I have like a Well Savvy page there. But you can find me on LinkedIn, and I do have folks occasionally reach out to me by word of mouth for counseling on LinkedIn. So that's also a way that you could certainly reach me.
Well,
Yeah.
we're gonna blow up your Instagram and LinkedIn account, so stay tuned.
Well, maybe you'll give me some inspiration to like find the time to do
This is
it.
important. This was a phenomenal podcast. This was a phenomenal interview. And Brooke, I can't thank you enough.
Thank you guys. It was super fun. And I haven't done this before, so it was good for me too, just to kind of have the experience of how that works.
Absolutely. Thank you again. As just echoing Bruce, but that was very enjoyable and tons of fantastic tips.
Yeah, you're very welcome, guys.
Awesome.
Good luck. Good luck with the podcast. I'll have to follow along.
Absolutely,
Thank
Brooke.
you.
And thank you for going against the herd.
You're welcome.